Thank you, Ambassador Ron. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. We are squeaky clean. Canada is a leader of the world, and many Koreans. And as a Canadian of Korean origin, I'm very proud to be a Canadian these days. So I just want to warn you in advance that your lunchtime will be squeezed in by 30 minutes. And there are a whole bunch of people that I like to acknowledge and thank. And I'll do that throughout the day before I ask Jonathan Miller to start the first session. Just want to recognize a few people that are with us. I may miss some people, then our staff members will give me a note that I missed so and so, so I'll introduce others there. But I'd like to start by asking the, just quickly raise your hand when I mention your name. Former Ambassador Marius Grenius, Ambassador Michael Danner, and the other two ambassadors that have helped me put this forum together. They're not here, but Ambassador Eric Walsh and Ambassador Len Edwards. Want to acknowledge them. I'd like to acknowledge Consul General Han Sung-won from the Korean Embassy in Ottawa. I'd like to thank President Young-hae Lee from the Canada-Korea Society. I'd like to thank a few MPs that are either here or will be coming in, but MP Ziad Abutaf. Oh, just left, sorry, right, just missed the time, okay. MP Garrett Genus, not here yet, okay. MP Elias Assi, no, not yet, okay. Now I'd like to introduce our first Canadian of Korean origin who was elected to the member of the Parliament. It happens to be a female member. Nellie Shen is with us. Also like to acknowledge Ambassador of Vietnam, Ambassador Cao Phong Pham. And there'll be several more I'll be introducing throughout the day, but I want to make sure that we get the conversation going. So I'd like to call upon a good friend and who's been helping me put this forum together with our team, Jonathan Miller. The stage is all yours. And the panel speakers, if you can take your nameplate with you up to the front stage, that'd be much appreciated.
And while we all get our seats, Sonny, you're such a humble guy, but let's get around for Sonny and his team. So what began on the sort of the back of a napkin, Sonny, several months ago, the visionary idea of hosting this conference has come to this. So Sonny, as I said, we just had one round of applause, but a real hats off to you for this, because I think not only for gathering all these folks here today, but for the visionary title and focus of what we're here to concentrate on today. And I think Ambassador An has raised the bar here for panel one. So you have left some areas left to discuss, but I think that we've raised a fairly significant bar. And I would agree with you, Ambassador An and others, that the time clearly is now for the Canada-Korea relationship, for Canada's relationship in the Indo-Pacific. clearly we had some significant travel of late. And I had an interesting discussion over lunch with some Korean friends recently. And we were talking, unfortunately, of course, our prime minister couldn't visit the region recently because of the hurricane. But Minister Jolie did visit South Korea and Japan. And one of the comments was that, unfortunately, in Canada, and maybe this is an area of improvement that we need to work on, it didn't receive a whole lot of press attention. I know many in this room probably were very focused on this, including myself, but it didn't receive a lot of attention. What received more attention in the media was the news of BTS and their decision to serve in the military dutifully. So maybe we need to appoint one of the members of BTS as one of our special envoys to the Indo-Pacific. We have a great panel here, and as I've told everyone here on our panel, again, apologies for your long and distinguished bios, but the purpose of this very lovely book that everyone has here is that I will not read them out. Take my word for it. Everyone here has a long track record and experience on the Korean Peninsula. Starting from my left, we have here Kim Young-jun, Professor of National Security Affairs at the Korea National Defense University. And then we have Mr. Christopher Green, a senior consultant for the International Crisis Group, and also an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands, which Chris and I were joking last night. The Netherlands has an Indo-Pacific strategy out already, several months before Canada. So this is sort of nudging us along to hopefully finish the task that we've set forth for ourselves. And last but definitely not least, we have Trevor Kennedy, Vice President of Policy at the Business Council of Canada. So we're delighted to have everyone joining us. Young-jun, will go to you first because this is the pain you have from traveling the farthest away. We pick on you to go first. But before doing that, I did want to set the scene a little bit. And part of this discussion, we're not going to, explore all the reasons why we should be engaging in the Indo-Pacific. I think not just Canada, but Korea, we know these drivers. We've known them for some time. But I think it's important, especially with the recent context that we face, because policymakers have scarce resources. They have a lot of different priorities, and inevitably these questions about where we focus these resources, why we focus these resources will come into play. So obviously the first data point and contextual point that we need to be focusing on, and that you just need to turn on your social media feed or your television to see, is Russia's brutal and illegal war in Ukraine, and the inevitable focus of many in the NATO alliance, including Canada, including actually Korea as a member of the Asia Pacific Four, and maybe this is something that can come up in one of the panels today, is the significance of Korea's relationship with NATO and transatlantic security as well. That is a significant factor. If you think back to the United States, for example, and its shifting sort of words on the way it engages in the region, from the pivot with Obama originally to the rebalance to the free and open Indo-Pacific, one of the constant worries, I think, amongst Asia hands in the United States was distraction that might shift attention away from the Indo-Pacific region, which was considered most consequential to US interests. Again, I think we have to be careful in the way we think on this, because we do need to be there for our European friends, but we also can't lose touch and track of what is really important in the peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. So that's the first data point, is managing the challenge right now in the transatlantic sphere, but also at the same time in the Indo-Pacific. And I would include, when I say the Indo-Pacific, often there's a feeling that I'm just talking about China, but clearly, and Ambassador An mentioned this in his remarks, the challenges with North Korea are a very significant challenge. I remember when I was living in Japan in 2017, and the first missile flew over Japanese airspace, and I was on my futon and my phone's shaking at 4:30 in the morning. I was like, oh, another little earthquake tremor or something. This is a real security threat for South Korea and Japan, and more broadly for the region. So when we think about Indo-Pacific security, yes, there are a lot of challenges that need to be mitigated from China, but we can't forget the challenges from North Korea as well. The second one is that in addition to Russia's war in Ukraine, we're in an increasing environment of information overload, and much of that information is not good. So the disinformation environment, we're seeing it at an acute level, obviously, right now because of what's happening in Ukraine, but this is also something that's affecting the Indo-Pacific region. And I think this is a core area that Canada and Korea need to focus on, but it's also a key challenge to manage. We're trying to develop a strategy for this region. And the third and potentially the most important contextual point that I think everyone needs to frame their thinking about when thinking about how the two countries could engage in this region are the economic realities. Frankly, we are not in a good situation economically right now in a G7 and G20 context. I think many countries already are in recession. Others will be tipping into recession soon. There are scarce resources. Those resources will become more scarce. So while we can all agree on the importance of such engagement, I think we need to frame into this the economic challenges that we face today and we are likely to face tomorrow. There are no money trees. Maybe the Fed or central banks would make us believe that there are money trees, but the reality is those resources will remain scarce. So with that sort of dark cloud that I've painted, to begin, why don't I start with you, Professor Kim, with some thoughts from Seoul, and then I'll make my way down the table. I will say, I'll try not to be a strong taskmaster here, but do try to keep your remarks as brief as possible. We'd really like to get in, I hope, about 20 to 30 minutes of audience questions through this session. And if we can not cut into your lunch as much as possible, I think that would be an advisable thing. So, Professor Kim.
Thank you, John, and thank you very much for having me as a panel member for this wonderful forum. Actually, I was very impressed by the peaceful unification of our council in Toronto chapter. Made this event is one of the best conference I ever attend. Also, opening ceremony as Ambassador An Ho-young and Mr. Champagne and Mr. Choi and Mr. Kim is one of the best opening ceremony I ever attend, because in general opening ceremony is just say hello as a good remark, but now especially Ambassador An's speech is one of the best speech I ever heard, like the former President Obama when I was in 2008. So I really appreciate for your wonderful speech and Mr. Champagne as well. I think it's his word about market economy with the human face of Canada is much like a symbol why we love Canada as a Korean and why we merge together for the future, because we share the value rule-based order, which is already Ambassador emphasized on. Now is Korean has been always the front line between the two great power zones, right? It's a land power, sea power. Land power means China, Russia, and sea power is Japan and the US. And Japanese invasion of Korea in the 16th century, and also hundreds of times of Chinese invasion of Korea show the history about how much Korean people have to interest in our peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. And in the past, many foreigners, and they surprised when they recognize how much Korean people love to talk about their politics, right? We have a three Korean, they have a three party among three Korean people, because we have to concern about our destiny between the great power over the 2000 years. That's why naturally we are always talking about foreign policy and security and North Korean provocation as in everyday life, rather than my other European friend, American friend, who are not interested in foreign policy as their vote right for the election. But Korean people is very, very interesting North Korean policy and everyday North Korean provocation naturally because of our own destiny over the 2000 years. So I'd like to make the two arguments from my speaking very shortly, maybe less than 10 minutes for our wonderful conversation and a beautiful lunch. So first one is I want to make the why Canada Republic of Korea shoot together, because we share the value absolutely, and we also want to have a wonderful relationship for the Indo-Pacific century. I think it's Korea and Canada as a middle power between the great power. We always the first by the great power to make the choice between them, right? The China or the U.S. But naturally, our choice is the U.S. and liberal democracy, human rights, and marketing. Why not? But at the same time, we have a great relation with China because of economic issue and neighboring country. So I think as a middle power country, we have to decide our own destiny rather than just decide one on another. So I think it's Canada and Republic of Korea have to together as a middle power country to choose their own destiny rather than just choosing one side on another. Because of the Korean Peninsula always is a front line between the great power country for war. So the Korean War is one of the best example between the great powers. So now it's North Korea is another provocation issue. Over the years, I was deeply engaged in Moon government as a member of the National Security Council advisory board. I was deeply engaged in Pyongyang summit, also the Singapore and Hanoi summit as a denuclearization advisor. And we have also feels like million years ago, but it was just happened 2017, 18, we remember, and 2019. 2017 is a kind of war scenario. As everybody remember, Trump really want to attack with their strategic bombing for the Yongbyon nuclear facility. And then we have the great peaceful negotiation, whatever somebody criticized a political show or whatever. And then at the end, with the failed result from the Hanoi summit. And then now, I think it's again over 2017, North Korea now has a free hand, right, to develop their nuclear missile capability because they recognize China and Russia will never join any kind of sanction for the next decade because of the new Cold War situation. So now we have faced a lot of nuclear option against the North Korean nuclear and missile provocation. Now internally, Korean people talk about NATO style of nuclear sharing or the introduction of tactical nuclear weapons or even self-defense nuclear development as well, just like Israel. So now it's the internal Korean people always talk about how we survive from another North Korean provocation and how we survive between US and China competition for a while. So I would like to suggest my idea on that is we have now faced two methodology in solving problem. First one is a load to NATO, right? We maybe have a strengthening our partnership with our American friend, maybe possibly more nuclear option in the Korean Peninsula, and joining the Five Eyes countries and joining the Quad, joining the other option, AUKUS, whatever. And another road is through organization, security, and cooperation in Europe case. I think it's a more arms control and peace and security choice, which is successful over the decade. So now is we need to choose one or another, NATO role or OSCE role. So I just been to two interesting international conferences the last May and April. The May is about NATO Defense Conference as a Korean delegation in Hamburg of Germany. Naturally, conversation is focused on the Russian-Ukraine war, but the slogan is Russian-Ukraine war. But every country will talk about China, Chinese invasion possibility on Taiwan. Taiwan is president of NDU attend there. Ukraine president of NDU also attend there. So naturally, everybody talk about blaming Putin, but at the same time, final result about how we deter Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Naturally, so we talk about our strategy or our methodology in containing China together. But at the same time, we talk about the OSCE case for the next decade. So we need to be balanced between the load to NATO or load to OSCE. We don't have to be the choose one or another. We have to prepare for that. And at the same time, we also have to remember two historical lessons from the First and Second World War. We are always talking about Chamberlain lesson, right? ignoring Hitler's invasion or something like that. We always criticize appeasement policy of our former Prime Minister Chamberlain of the UK. Yes, we know that lesson every day we talk about, but we must not forget about Woodrow Wilson lesson as well, because as you remember, after the First World War, Woodrow Wilson failed to propose the ideal of the League of Nations because of the opposition of the GOP at the time. If we had a League of Nations in Geneva at the time, maybe we more likely wistfully the detail Hitler's invasion on Polish or French. But we always talk about the Chamberlain lesson, but not talking about the Woodrow Wilson lesson. So we need to remember both of them as when we talk about the foreign policy option. So now, secondly, I would like to suggest as an expert of North Korean history, how we thought about North Korean-China relation. North Korea definitely a bad boy and dictatorship country. Everybody know that. And we always support the human rights, the issue of North Korea for their own people. But at the same time, we need to remember North Korea-China relationship is not as the same as the other example of two communist countries, because we have to have a question: why Kim Jong-un came to the Singapore and Hanoi? Why spend so many energy? And why they lose their face? If he was just political show, Kim Jong-un would not have that kind of show for 1.5 years. But Kim Jong-un and Kim Il-sung had a different grand strategic concept as a young generation. They are different from Kim Jong-il. They are different from the Kim Il-sung as well. They want to have their own successful model, maybe like the dictatorship country, but at the same time rich country supported by other Western countries. So we always talking about China is able to suppress North Korea, but it's not. History shows North Korea always worry about Chinese influence over the North Korean domestic politics. So they have a military coup in 1956, and Kim Il-sung also his own personal history as a Minsendan incident, which is assassinated by Japanese, not Japanese police, but their own Chinese colleague during the 1920-1930 in Manchuria. So Kim Il-sung colleague was purged by his Chinese senior colleague over the two decades. As a young teenager, Kim Il-sung has a very much concern about Chinese influence. Also 1956, also he faced about the Chinese faction of North Korean politics military coup. So we need to also have a question: why Kim Jong-il did not ask any help when they suffered from the 1990 famine? We remember millions of North Korean people died during the 1990, and Kim Jong-un failed his negotiation with the President Bush, because President Al Gore lost the election, so we lost the opportunity about making peace on the Korean Peninsula. But after that, Kim Jong-il just stay his place without asking China for a lot of food and support in saving their own people. Why? Kim Jong-il didn't want to do it, and China did not have a lot for the North Korean people during 1990. That's why it's a million people, North Korean people died during the 1990. That is a complexity between two countries. They are good neighbor, but at the same time, they have a very complicated relation. So I think it is some opportunity for us to make this area to make new balance of power, which I mean we can have a North Korea in our side by improving their human rights, also decreasing their nuclear missile threat step by step. You remember Ukraine case? They spent 20 or 30 years in denuclearization of their own nuclear missile. We call CVID. That's one of the most successful case of denuclearization. So how about 20 or 30 years about Ukraine cases of CVID? How about 40 years? There's a step-by-step of CVID. We don't know. We are not able to define. But we need the time to in decreasing North Korean nuclear missile threat with having North Korea in our side more be independent from the Chinese influence. Now it's more than 95% of North Korean trading from China, which means North Korean regime concerned about too much Chinese influence. That's why when he purged Kim Jong-nam and his uncle Jang Song-taek, they blaming them as a pro-Chinese spy, not U.S. imperial spy. So this is a language we have to understand why Kim Jong-un come to this Singapore and Hanoi, and how can we solve the problem North Korea with a new perspective of the thinking. I call Henry Kissinger paradigm. So we need to have a North Korea, and China is more fundamental problem. Rather, North Korea is an immediate threat, but at the same time, North Korea is same nation for South Korea to have for unification for the long term. So we need to think about how to solve this kind of problem. So I love to have our Vietnamese ambassador here, but I so-called we remember the Vietnam War case about the Vietnamese and China relation. So North Korea want to be really independent from China and really want to have their own destiny, the main player. So maybe we can have this situation in a different way, like Henry Kissinger mindset, I call new balance of power. This will be more fundamental solution rather than just having our own nuclear weapon, because the nuclear arms race is more increasing our war-like scenario on the Korean Peninsula. Okay, I love to have a technical nuclear weapon, but at the same time, maybe China-Russia military exercise will have a North Korea as a partnership. Now we're concerned about China-Russia military exercise, right? Then maybe we are able to see Chinese PLA in Wonsan. Maybe 20,000 PLA soldiers are able to work with North Korean KPA in 5 years. We cannot deter because their sovereign nation can decide their own military exercise. So it will be a nightmare scenario. So if we have a more security partnership in this way, North Korea and China, Russia will have a more security partnership. Maybe they'll have their nuclear umbrella, their own extended deterrence. Maybe North Korea will have a Russian missile in their territory in 5 years, in 10 years. This will be game changer. So I would like to suggest we need to have a more wise step in solving a fundamental solution about North Korea problem. And North Korea really want to have a new partnership with a Western country, not because of Kim Jong-un good guy, but because of Kim Jong-un want to have their own legitimacy. So their model will be, I think, is a Middle East country who have a dictatorship guaranteed by Western country who have a rich quality of life to North Korean people. And we have to think about North Korean human rights. North Korean human rights is very important issue. We never forget. But at the same time, North Korean people really want to have a hot shower, good house, a right to have a food, rather than vote for their changing political regime. This should be a final step. So maybe we can have a step-by-step to approach to human rights. First step will be North Korea having a hot shower and good housing. And the second step will be a little bit limited to right to move by themselves, maybe Pyongyang to Wonsan without permission. And final step will be North Korean version of their own governance, maybe local government level or something like that. So we need a roadmap rather than just saying human rights. Yes, we love human rights, but we need more strategy in having increasing step of North Korean human rights. One step, second step, maybe with a 50 years roadmap, with decreasing their own nuclear missile threat. So I would like to suggest that we need to have a road to OSCE in Northeast Asia with our friend. Also, at the same time, we must not forget Woodrow Wilson lesson, not just Chamberlain lesson. And finally, we need to have a different perspective in solving North Korean problem, having North Korea in our side as a more democratic in the end. So Canada is a very important partnership country because Canada doesn't have a geopolitical ambition or economical ambition in the Korean Peninsula directly. US and China is a good friend, but it's a different range. If Canadian have a more loud speaking on Korean Peninsula issue, this will be very, very important for the international community. So let's have a more the cooperation for the long-term future. So I finish my remarks, and I just suggested my idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kim. You've kept the bar high, so very much appreciate it. And I have a lot of questions, but I'll save myself. But just a couple sort of points before moving on to Chris. I liked the fact that you made a lot of different interconnections there. One of the very important ones was your interconnection between human rights issues in North Korea and regional security issues, international security issues. And in fact, we hosted an event a couple of weeks ago with a couple in the audience, Marius and Charles Burton, I think, is here as well, that precisely talked on that point, that we can't silo those discussions and say, wow, there's a human rights discussion that needs to be had, but there's a missile and WMD discussion that needs to be had. I think we need to look at those issues in tandem. And on human rights, there's obviously domestic issues that are affecting North Korean citizens, which are horrible and horrendous, but there's also international issues. Such as the abductions issue, which remains unresolved for Japan. So that's a really great interconnection you mentioned. I also like your discussion on the importance of looking at security issues not in a silo. Your potential dark forecast, for example, of joint exercises, trilateral exercises between DPRK, China and Russia. We are seeing a significant uptick in military activity between Russia and China. And I think that's a trend that we're going to see continuing, involving North Korea more into that mix. I think is a scenario that I don't think a lot of us want to see, but is a potential one. And a couple data points that show that looking at the Korean Peninsula situation as separate doesn't make sense. One example is the Russia's war in Ukraine, for example. Yes, North Korea might not be providing the most advanced weaponry to Russia, but there is a provision of supplies, artillery, etc., to Russia, which it's using to brutalize Ukrainians on the battlefield. So we can't completely disconnect these issues. And the last point I would make, and this sort of gets me thinking, because next month I'll be simulating a war game discussion on a Taiwan contingency. And one of the things that I think when I think of the Taiwan contingency, and you mentioned this, is often we tend to box it in, and there's a temptation to say, okay, well, something will happen over Taiwan. Well, how will the players act? I don't think we can rule out something happening in the Korean Peninsula at the same time. I'm not saying it will, but the idea that we can just treat what's happening in Pyongyang as something separate, completely disconnect it with all of the other regional security issues, I don't necessarily know that that's the right approach either. So I think we need to at least entertain the possibility that we could be dealing with multiple problems on multiple fronts, the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, Senkaku, and the South China Sea all at the same time. A nightmare scenario, but potential. So again, with that very light an optimistic tone, Professor Green, Christopher, the floor is yours, and we'll be interested to hear your insights.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I will spare you the reiteration, all the nice comments that Professor Kim gave to the organizers and to Ottawa and to Canada and so on. I love Canada too. Even though I'm not Korean, I'm allowed to love Canada as well. I prepared a presentation with points, subpoints, subpoints, and some more points besides, but I did settle eventually on the subject that was on that banner at your conference in Hamburg, the impact of the Ukraine conflict on East Asian dynamics, not just in terms of the provision of weaponry potentially by North Korea to the Russian side, but more generally cannot be overstated at this point. It's obviously a catalyst. The Ukraine conflict is being keenly felt in East Asia, probably more keenly felt than one might have expected when it began in late February. Of course, global energy prices are playing a role in that process, imposing the same inflationary pressures on the economies of the democracies in the region as being imposed on Canada and countries in Europe and around the world, dependent as Korea is in particular on imported energy. But energy is just the tip of what seems to be a growing iceberg. Russia's invasion was not supposed to happen, representing a form of conflict, this premeditated invasion of a neighboring sovereign state, which Japan and Korea and the rest of us had rather fondly hoped had been consigned to the dustbin of history several decades ago. This kind of regression brings multifaceted problems, and these are being keenly felt in Seoul and no doubt also here in Ottawa as well. Of course, it's worth saying that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is not the source of any geopolitical tension per se in East Asia. China's emergence as a military power has been going on for ages, as we know. North Korea's belligerence regarding the South has an even longer history than that. But this conflict is, as I said, a very effective catalyst for some pre-existing fears and concerns, and none of Canada's natural partners in the region seem at all pleased to have to immediately, with great urgency, commit to wide-ranging reviews of what national security means in this new environment that we're facing. Some of the regional responses are worth raising. This is a new and fast-moving task environment. Japan obviously is the most clear in that it has signaled a dramatic increase in defense expenditures. Broadly speaking, welcome, and a very radical shift, just like the radical shift that we've seen in Germany. South Korea signed on to international condemnation of Russia's actions, and somewhat belatedly also the accompanying sanctions. In meetings with people in the foreign ministry in Seoul, I repeatedly hear this frustration that it took a little longer than it should have to sign on to those international sanctions. But in the end, we got there, and now everyone is in alignment, broadly speaking, on these issues. The problem is that this is very positive, broadly speaking, but the overall situation may well get worse. And the question then is, how are we going to be able to respond to that? The most obvious concern for me is the way the Ukraine conflict is exacerbating trends in public opinion. East Asian democracies seem to be moving in a hawkish direction, pushing their leaders with growing speed towards political conflict or confrontation, not conflict. Take that back. It goes without saying that political entrepreneurs in both countries are bound to seize upon this opportunity, this widening Overton windows, if you will, for their own ambitions. The results are unpredictable at best and potentially dangerous at worst. Of course, the democracies are not sitting idly by. As noted, Japan is increasing its defense expenditure, and in the process clarifying the conditions under which conflict with China could take place. In the short and medium term, that clarity is welcome, especially with regards to how Japan sees Taiwan, because I take the point that you cannot isolate the Taiwan issue or the Korea issue. You have to look at this region in the round at this particular moment in time. And Japan's view of Taiwan is very important to that understanding. Japan emphasizes informally how it would respond to a Chinese attack on American forces in Okinawa, which seems to be seen as a necessary step that would have to be taken by China if there were to be a Taiwan contingency in the near future. The reality is that Japan-Korea tensions, driven in part by public opinion, are not helpful in managing these difficult times. The words of Lee Jae-myung, the opposition leader in Seoul, are a rather jarring example of this, voicing the idea that joint exercises with Japan could lead to Japanese boots on the ground in Korea. Such sentiments, I think, are a little opportunistic and unwelcome, but they resonate, rightly enough, with a sizable proportion of the Korean population, and Japan does not seem to realize the importance of aiding Korea in dealing with that challenging situation. Japan's indifference, apparent indifference, as far as I can discern, to Korean interests and concerns since the collapse of the 2015 Comfort Women deal is equally understandable and perhaps also quite inopportune. So it is a result of such historical schisms that Japan does not seem eager to include South Korea in the Quad, for example. And indeed that Korea may have failed to return in a timely manner to the issue of its radar mapping of the Japanese surveillance aircraft. prior to the pandemic. Clearly, because of bilateral relations then, essentially the bilateral relations are domestic political variables in both countries, especially Korea. It is not easy to maintain those relations, and yet we must maintain them. For Korea is a key partner for Japan and for all of us. Anyone who cares about freedom and liberty in East Asia should see Japan and Korea that way. Of course, it's not this panel's job to speak about what exactly should be done, but it is obvious to me that one of Canada's key roles in this context is to participate in multilateral operations that help to keep Korea and Japan in concert on military matters, to help not only to demonstrate the liberal world's commitment to freedom, but to ensure the capacity of all friendly states in the region to coordinate in the event of unwelcome rises in tensions. It's a small probability event, the idea that Russia might resort to nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Small probability event, but one with such wide-ranging consequences that it is worth raising nevertheless. The situation would be 10 times worse if such an event were to occur, not least because it would visit horrors upon Eastern Europe, of course, but it would also exacerbate the public opinion movement towards East Asian nuclear proliferation. The administration of President Yoon has been very clear that this is not something it is currently thinking about. Nuclearization is not on its agenda, and that clarity is very welcome, of course it is. But if Russia were to resort to some kind of nuclear weapon in Ukraine, then the Yoon administration's decision would, of course, come to be challenged vociferously internally. And that challenge is one that we can ill afford to allow to come to pass. Public opinion, as I have said 3 times now, I think, is on the side of Korean nuclearization. And the alliance commitments of the political class in Seoul with countries like Canada are very important to hold back this rising tide. The same is not quite true of Japan, whose commitments to pacifism seem to run deeper. But a nuclearized South Korea coming so soon after the nuclearization of North Korea, of course, very important, and in the lee of some hypothetical actual nuclear use in Europe, would stretch patience in Tokyo as well. Of course it would. In this context, there is this non-trivial risk too, as Professor Kim alluded to, I think, or maybe it was you, Jonathan, that the UN sanctions regime against North Korea could collapse in the next decade, completely, leaving US Treasury sanctions as the only sanctions regime holding whatever line as may remain. The last thing we need under such circumstances is for nuclear dominoes to fall, leaving the global non-proliferation architecture in tatters behind it. Anyway, back in 2017, which I have to say feels like a very long time ago when it actually wasn't, one observer of Canadian affairs, much more knowledgeable than me, wrote that, and I quote, "Canada's diplomatic and strategic engagement in East Asia has been erratic over the past 2 decades. Successive governments have been incapable or unwilling to clearly articulate a regional strategy, remaining virtually silent on major geopolitical tensions," end quote. I'm not qualified to say whether that's true, although I don't doubt the possibility that it is. And besides, it was a different age, but my point is that the time for such sitting on the fence has clearly passed, and it seems to me that Canada knows that, and we will be able to move in productive directions going forward as a result. So I'll leave it there, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Chris, thanks so much. Excellent insights. And I won't even say the bar now. Now it's a gauntlet has been laid down for you, Trevor. But before I get to you, and very interested now in pivoting this discussion specifically to Canada and the Indo-Pacific strategy and how we manage some of these issues. But Chris, you raised a number of very important points. One point that I think is important, and one that, having spent 10 years of my life in Japan, and you know, as much as I wanted to give up on looking at the Japan-Korea relationship out of frustration, I agree that it's an indispensable relationship, and it's a necessary ingredient to deal with many of the security challenges in this region. So yes, there are, of course, political obstacles, historical obstacles, but I think it's absolutely a relationship that's necessary, not just in dealing with issues on DPRK, not just in dealing with security issues relating to China, but on issues such as critical minerals, supply chains, infrastructure development. I think Japan and Korea can be an extremely good force for good international public goods in this region. Very, very necessary. A hint of optimism is that I do see, I don't want to overextend on this and say that we've seen a complete change of direction, but I do see the initial baby steps of positive movement in this direction. Even on the military side, GSAMIA is now back in force, the military information sharing agreement. The whitelist nightmare is sort of a little bit, we hope, is in the past. Operation Neon, obviously, which Canada is involved in, is something that we work closely with the Japanese colleagues and Korean colleagues, in addition to trilateral military exercises, et cetera. So there is somewhat of a restoration of normalcy in that security relationship. The one thing I would say with Canada too, and taking my half American side and putting it to the side for now, the U.S. obviously is the main element in dealing with Japan and South Korea. They're mutual allies. Sometimes that's not always a positive. We need the U.S., but sometimes finding different forums, different engagements, different partners that avoids the U.S. If we had the Japanese and Koreans in the room, maybe they would quietly say this as well. They love the U.S. It's their treaty ally. But sometimes there's all sorts of complications and dynamics when the U.S. is involved in every discussion. So this potentially opens the door for Canada not to play a mediation or moderating role on their historical disputes, but to find ways to work with those two Northeast Asian anchors on areas of shared interest. So that maybe is something that we can get into in panel 2. Also, very important point on nuclear use. I agree with you. And I mean, rather than, while the possibility may be remote, we hope it's remote, for the idea of a tactical nuclear weapon, Russian nuclear weapon being used in Ukraine, I think we need to think about those implications in a manifest sense. We can't just think about it, oh, well, this might lead to conflict between NATO and Russia or potentially nuclear conflict. I think we absolutely need to be thinking about the implications for US alliance networks more broadly. And one story that I mentioned to some of the panelists last night at our dinner was when President Obama made his famous red line speech in Syria about chemical weapons use, and of course didn't cross, the red line was crossed, and there was no kinetic response to the Assad regime. I was actually in Seoul on that day for a US-Japan South Korea security dialogue, and we did a straw poll of Japan and South Korean officials and think tankers at the time, and asked them whether they thought that was the right decision. And almost unanimously, everyone said no, that was not a good decision. The United States president sets a barrier, sets a threshold that can't be crossed, and once it's crossed, there's no response. That means things for the credibility of extended deterrence. So again, I think nuclear use is a horrific precedent. The idea of disaggregating and saying tactical and strategic, I know they're different, but we shouldn't be discriminating. Nuclear use is nuclear use in the battlefield, and it needs to be remain unacceptable. So Trevor, I'm going to pass the floor off to you with all of these insights that everyone has provided so far. Now we can pivot a little bit to the Canadian perspective. If you can tell us specifically when the Indo-Pacific strategy comes out, you get bonus points and a more deluxe lunch. But we're excited to hear your insights.
Thanks, Jonathan. And can you hear me? Okay. Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here today, and to Sunny for organizing this event. So I think my remarks will be a little bit different, just given the organization I work for and our view of the Indo-Pacific and Canada-Korea relationship. So I'm going to speak first about Canada and the Indo-Pacific, and some of, I guess, the purpose of this panel is to talk about what are the issues or what are the challenges, rather than talk about some of the solutions. But I may get ahead of the next panel on some of that. So and then I'll speak about the Canada-Korea relationship, which is very exciting recently, at least from a business perspective. We've had some really good engagement with our partners in Korea. So first, just a point I always like to make right off the top. We believe Canada is an Indo-Pacific country. We have considerable economic interests in the region. Many of our businesses, the companies that we represent at the Business Council, have been in the Indo-Pacific, either across the region or in specific markets, for well over 100 years. And so we feel this is very much a region that we belong in, and and we have a real role in the future. But one risk that we have observed is that outside of Canada, unfortunately, we're not often viewed as part of the region. And we can see that, very recent examples, the creation of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, very important initiative from the United States. They picked 14 countries, we're not one of them. And so that's a concern. And there's other multilateral initiatives in the Indo-Pacific that unfortunately we've been left out of. So that's a problem. And one of the things that probably doesn't help is the fact that, as others have noted, we don't have a strategy for the Indo-Pacific. Canada does not have a national strategy. We're very pleased to see that this work has been going on for some time now. And I can't say specific dates because truthfully, I don't know, but I understand it will come out very soon. And we'll be paying close attention to that. And I think it's very important that not only Canada releases a strategy, but it's a strategy that's in public, that people can review, that our partners can review. So I don't know what the government's intentions are around releasing it, but anyway, we're very eager to see it, I think, as everybody else in this room is. And something else too, we often talk about the Indo-Pacific just from Canada getting away from North America, but truthfully, this is also important for our relationship with the United States. It's our most important ally and partner, and we see that it's increasingly focused on the Indo-Pacific. And so we need to be there. We need to be part of the way they think about the region. So there's really a lot at play here. But like I said, I'll try and focus on some maybe more the business, the economic side of this equation. And for the Indo-Pacific, I'm going to focus on a few points that my president and CEO Goldie Hyder made in a very recent book. So I have a copy here. So I'm just going to plug this very quickly. It's called The Indo-Pacific: New Strategies for Canadian Engagement with the Critical Region. We have a chapter in the book on the business perspective. I'm actually pleased to see a couple of the contributors are here. I see Jeff Nankerville from the Asia Pacific Foundation wrote an excellent chapter on China. Jim Mitchell also wrote a piece on the machinery of government. And we have others that aren't in the room that have contributed, but a really good collection of essays available for purchase today. So first, the first theme that we looked at is economic growth. So really, it's remarkable the speed and scale of growth throughout the region. It's important to note that the Indo-Pacific is not monolithic. We have very different types of economies, very different opportunities. And so often we're talking about some of the emerging markets and the faster growing middle classes throughout the region. But South Korea is also a very important economy. It usually leads the OECD in growth. And I think if we look at our economic relationship, I think we'd all agree that there's a lot more we can do. So it's important that Canada looks at some of the advanced economies, Korea being one of them, Japan being another. But so that's a focus. How do we unlock some more of the opportunity around growth? A point that doesn't come up as much in Canada as it did several years ago, but this is kind of an evergreen issue for Canada, is around the issue of diversification. We have a very productive relationship with the United States. It's our most important trade partner, probably always will be. But it's a risk for us to rely too significantly on one market. So it remains a national within our interest, our economic interest, to diversify our economic relations. And there we see the Indo-Pacific really being critical to achieving our diversification targets. And then the other theme is around relevance. Canada has been very fortunate being where we are and having the neighbor that we have. My last count, if you looked at the Fortune Global 500, we have, I believe, 14 companies on that list today. Every year, some of them do fall on that list. If we want to continue to have a good standing and to really punch above our weight, we're going to need to grow where a lot of the growth is. And so if we hope that Canada's home to many of the world's leading firms, we're going to have to be bigger in the Indo-Pacific. And that includes the advanced and emerging markets. And although I was talking a lot about areas for improvement, I also want to note, and this is something that we hope to see in the strategy, we think that Canadian businesses, whether they be business leaders, firms themselves, or the associations, have some really important ties in the region, whether it's the Canada-Korea relationship or anywhere else. Actually, just for Korea in particular, you have an excellent CanCham in Korea. I've had the chance to meet some of the folks who run that great organization with a great network. Canada-Korea Business Council. So there are great groups that have networks that could be leveraged more effectively in an Indo-Pacific strategy and involving the business community. The Business Council of Canada, we have a very strong and growing relationship with the Federation of Korean Industries. It's a very new relationship and one that we're excited to further develop. We just signed an MOU when Vice Chairman Kwan visited for the Canada-Korea Forum last month, and we hope to establish a CEO dialogue between Canada and Korea. So we're doing some excellent work there. It's a good segue into the Canada-Korea relationship specifically. So first on trade, it's a positive relationship. Canada-Korea free trade agreement has helped to expand our economic relationship. It's underdeveloped still, and Canada really is lagging when it comes to exports. So there's a lot more that we can do to get our products to market. One of the ways that we can do this is by accelerating the development of trade enabling infrastructure. And one product in particular is kind of embracing Canada's role as a major LNG exporter. So we're very excited to have LNG Canada come online in a couple of years. There's prospect for expansion in the future and other projects that could have a significant impact on our bilateral trade flows with Korea. And we hope to see many more projects in the future. And we've heard loud and clear that Korean industry is very interested in Canadian critical minerals. They're interested in hydrogen. And it's our responsibility in Canada to make sure that we move quickly and provide enough certainty and stability to our partners in Korea that they can rely on us as they develop their future supply chains. Now, and trade policies is important as well. I mentioned Canada-Korea FTA. That's not the only opportunity for us. Along with the Federation of Korean Industries earlier this year, we publicly supported Korea's accession to the CPTPP. For officials in the room, please apply soon. But you can count on the support of the business community in Canada, as well as as I understand, the business community in Korea as well. So we think that'd be an important contribution to the relationship. And as I mentioned IPEF before, Korea is part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We're not. Canada should have a seat at the table, and if we are, we think that's an opportunity to strengthen the relationship further. So on another theme in the relationship, going beyond trade, as mentioned, we're doing a lot with Korea recently. We released a report earlier this year. Deanna Horton at the Munk School was the Canadian author. On the Korean side, Park Tae-ho, who is now the Korean co-chair of the Canada-Korea Forum, wrote two excellent reports that link together. And a real theme in those reports was partnership. So rather than what more can we sell to each other, where flows of investment, we really looked at how can our companies work together to be competitive. We're both medium-sized open trading economies, and the devolution of China-U.S. relations is potentially a risk for us, especially as both countries try to develop their technological capabilities. So it's important that our firms find ways to work together to boost their mutual competitiveness. And we've seen some interesting examples as of late. There's an excellent Magna and LG partnership, joint venture now a couple of years old. There are other partnerships. LG has made some really incredible investments. POSCO, others investing in Canada. And we think there's a lot more opportunity to, once again, boost our competitiveness. And just one final theme. So I had a chance to visit Korea earlier this year with our CEO, and it was a really great visit. It was our first visit outside of North America since the pandemic. It was a trip we planned to make before the pandemic, and so we're very pleased that we could make the trip. We had a chance to meet with many officials from the new administration, and one thing that really was really surprising to us to hear this from an official was to hear that, talking about the conflict in Ukraine and Canada being able to take a principled position, stand up for its interest, to hear from the Korean side that it hoped it could do the same. But at the moment, it lacks some of the economic security. It relies on unreliable countries for some of its resources, and really looking to Canada to say, how can you help us? How can you help us be a more active global player? So that's really on Canada, I think, to make sure that we can provide some security, economic security to our partner in South Korea. And once again, this goes back to us being able to develop our export capabilities and signaling very clearly to Korea that you can rely on us. So it's just a few themes. I guess we'll get into some other points, but I hope that helped with the conversation.
Thanks very much, Trevor. Very great insights. I echo your full-throated support of South Korea into the CPTPP. There's only one requirement or proviso, is that you cannot lengthen the acronym. And please, if you could shorten the acronym, that would be ideal. So if you join the CPTPP, please knock off one of the letters. It's gotten to be a mouthful. I still call it TPP-11. I think it comes out easier. So Trevor, a lot of very interesting points, and I think it actually segues really well into panel 2. There'll be more of a discussion on Canada's role in the region. A couple points before getting to Q&A, actually. So this will I'm stimulating time for everyone to start thinking of their questions. First of all, on perceptions and the idea of this strategy becoming public, I fully agree with you on this. And your issue of relevance, I think, is important. Ambassador On and others mentioned how Korea loves Canada, Koreans love Canada, Canadians, I'm sure Japanese do as well, or Vietnamese. But the issue is positivity and positive attitudes do not equate relevance. So I think we have to, yes, we're well liked in the region, but are we well thought of? One example I'll give on this, and I won't name the country, but I'm sure you can figure it out. One country has an Indo-Pacific strategy, and I did the word search in the PDF and looked for Canada, 0, not found. And I mentioned this to one of the senior diplomats here in Ottawa, and his answer was, "Oh, we just didn't think about it." So it was not an intentional issue to say, well, Canada hasn't been cooperating on this, so we feel like we're punishing you, and we're, going to promote the UK and France and others. It was just a factor of just not thinking of us. So this issue of relevance is very important, and I think promoting the public image, not just the nuts and bolts. We want to do tangible things, but we need to publicly emphasize why this region is important to us, and do it consistently, not just do it in one PDF document, but have officials going out constantly in the region. Interesting point on all of your elements on trade and investment. A basic point, but I think one that really needs to be hammered home too, is that the old notion of investment and trade and security being bifurcated, I mean, that world probably was never true in the first place, but definitely is not true nowadays. Some of the issues that we've already touched on, tech supply chains, energy security, trade agreements, CPTPP itself. You remember when Obama mentioned that this was essentially trying to give a national security rationale for the US getting into this agreement in the first place. So I think that we need to realize the different equities and stakes we have in this region. National security and economic are combined and not isolated, and they complement each other. And the last point, is I think people matter. Getting to the perceptions and getting to the idea of you may sort of be humble, Trevor, and just think that you just went to Korea and enjoyed a nice time in Korea, but those things matter. We need more and more people going to the region. All the weight does not have to be on the Royal Canadian Navy or a handful of diplomats and ambassadors, as effective as they are. We need a full Team Canada approach. The business council, private sector, academics, think tanks, the more people that are in the region for as long as possible, I think is a good thing. And on a final note and sort of pitch here, it might be too late to get under the door of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but thinking even of the optics of our special envoy now in Europe, and great, I like Stéphane Dion, he's a nice person, and I think it's great that we have a special envoy for Europe, especially these times. But there's always a perception cost when you have these. We already have a sitting ambassador in the EU. Now we have a special envoy. We opened 4 missions in Europe. It's great to reassure our European allies. What if you sit on a table with our Asian friends? What are they thinking about? The Indo-Pacific strategy is supposed to be the most important area that we're focusing on. So I just hope there's time to rectify these issues, but these perceptions are real issues, and hopefully Jonathan and our other colleagues will address these in panel 2. So now the floor is open, and hopefully, if we don't have too many questions, we won't be too late for lunch. But there is time, probably about 20 minutes or so for some Q&A. So feel free to give some hard questions to our panelists here, and just sort of raise your hand. And the one thing I would say is that please, if you do have a question, make it very brief. Ideally, no comments, but more questions. And you can either direct it to one of the panelists or to the entire panel. So floor is open. Don't be shy. Yes, Casey, please. And please introduce yourself, even though I know you can.
We don't have any diplomatic dialogue anymore.
Okay.
Second thing, Korea, you know, not like that effective because they self-sanctioned after 2020 January, a pandemic. They're the very first nation impose themselves the sanction, the lockdown. So Professor Kim said they were afraid in China. The third thing is because of the Ukraine war, Russia and China doesn't like they do not support any more sanction, UN sanction anymore. But all the Korean and all the world do not like see another Korean war. What's the best way to reopen the diplomatic dialogue with North Korea?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a really great question. I'm going to give that to the whole panel, but I would like to collect another couple. Maybe I'll collect 3 if that's okay with the panel here. So basically, some of the sanctions pressure, the challenges, and the integrity of the sanctions regime. I would agree. North Korea is essentially free riding on the lack of bandwidth we have right now in the international security community. There's so many priorities, and once again, North Korea is sort of taking advantage of that opportunity to sort of fly under the radar. More questions before we get back to the panel? And please do identify yourself if you can.
Good. Everyone hear me? No.
Project.
My name is Andrew Erskine. I'm a research analyst with the NATO Association of Canada. Question is for anyone here on the panel. It really kind of distinct in my mind today, just hearing from the panels, from the speakers today, is that in the Indo-Pacific and in Korea in particular, that there is this image of Canada, right? There's an image of Canada being an internationally well-received partner who is serious in their dedication, whether it be for geoeconomics, geosecurity, but also having the autonomy also to do what it believes is beneficial for its engagement in the region, along with its partners. With that in mind, I would just like to get kind of your input or your kind of perspective on, in order to engage the region better and to be seen to be engaging the region better, and to increase our ability to collect and to assess data on regional dynamics of whether it be geosecurity, geoeconomic data, should Canada pursue a strategy that could build or establish a block of, say, middle powers or smaller minor powers in the region through a multilateral form of 2+2 diplomatic dialogues that would showcase our willingness to engage the region, as well as gathering the tools and abilities to really understand what the dynamics of politics and I guess international relations are ongoing in the region.
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I see that sort of almost like a middle power BRICS with a liberal democratic orientation. So that's a great question, Andrew. Jeff, please.
Jeff, you go ahead. Jeff, go ahead.
You have the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Jim and Jeff.
I have
Jim,
a quick
Jeff.
question, Mr. Chair. I'd be interested in the views of the panel on what specific steps they'd like to see in the next 6 to 12 months to take advantage of the current high level of energy and interest in the Canada-Korea relationship. So what are some specific things you would like to see happen?
Okay, great. And then Jeff, and then we're going to close it for this round.
Jeff Nankivell from the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and newly minted author with no royalties, I should point out, but do buy Trevor's book. So my question is actually something I think that hasn't been mentioned yet, which is about humanitarian assistance. You know, historically, one of the major engagements for Western countries with North Korea has been through humanitarian assistance. Canada participated in that over the years. As a much younger person, I was a diplomat overseeing Canadian aid in Northeast Asia and worked on humanitarian assistance to DPRK. So I'm wondering, particularly for Mr. Kim and Mr. Green, if you have anything to say about how that has, what role that has played and what role humanitarian assistance may play in the coming years.
That's great. Great question as well. Okay, so we have a number of questions, and you all have 5 seconds each. No, you have. Try to be brief, though. Try to maybe about a couple minutes. You don't have to answer all of the questions, but basically we have one on the sanctions regime, the long-term strategy in North Korea, which could take a day. We have middle power diplomacy. What role could Canada play in that? We have the Canada-Korea relationship, some very tangible, concrete things that could come out of the most recent summitry. And the last one on humanitarian assistance, I think in particular related to DPRK. So, Professor Kim, with all that being said, your 2 minutes.
All right, honor to me. All excellent question, and especially here is we already have many figures who have a same worry about North Korean problem, especially Ambassador An, Ambassador Lim, and Mr. Chen, Mr. Kim has all kind of a worry about the how to solve the North Korean problem. Over the 4 decades, we did everything, every option. Sometimes sanctions, sometimes. Do you remember? We already have many kinds of way in solving North Korean problem, sanction and wait for collapse, especially over the Park Geun-hye government. We call the name of a strategic patient, but we failed. But we did everything possible solution for North Korea in engaging or opening up their dialogue. But I think now is a very difficult situation. Sometimes we need to be patient because now is Korean problem is not just Korea problem, right? International problem and U.S.-China competition. There is no pro-China politician in the U.S. They cannot survive, right? Over the Cold War period, we remember there is no pro-Soviet U.S. politician, right? Whatever they Democrat or GOP. Now it's the same situation. I think is that there is no U.S. politician who survive. They support more appeasement policy on China for the next decade. So I think it's the U.S.-China competition will be very long. Whatever we call new Cold War, whatever we call. So I think it's under this situation there is a very limited the option we have to open up North Korea. Even I say new balance of power thing or Vietnamization of North Korea way of the paradigm shift. But I think the only factor in changing all situation is only 2024 U.S. presidential. As I don't want to say, but possible election of Trump. But other than that, maybe we need to be patient because of unconventional way in opening up North Korea is a very difficult choice for the next decade. So we need to be patient. But anyway, we need to keep peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. So I think that regarding your question about humanitarian assistance, Kim Jong-un is a very different mindset from his father and grandfather, right? Kim Jong-il, his father, is largely dependent on intercolonial relation from Hyundai or something like that. If he has a great intercolonial relation, he got some economic assistance from South Korea. But Kim Jong-un wants to sell his own tourism industry without any kind of help, right? Kim Jong-un mentioned several times, I want to sell my own industry to the international, including Chinese tourists or European tourists. That's why KP soldier who the working for the general post in the demilitarized zone now is working as a labor forces for Wonsan Spa region. That is Kim Jong-un mindset. He wants to have his own industry from his experience from Switzerland. So in this sense, he doesn't want to have any kind of humanitarian system for free. He wants to sell his own industry. The problem is the sanction, right? So we need to have a more conversation with Kim Jong-un I really want the U.S. government to focus just one big enemy, rather than so many distracting North Korean small enemy. China is more fundamental problem, and China is now is I have a lot of good Chinese friends, but not personally as personal level. But Chinese dictatorship is bigger and bigger. Now their psychological and cyber operation has no regional border. So Korea and Canada and our European friend have to focus on Chinese issue rather than the other the issues. So that's why I suggest about the several way in opening up North Korea with a different perspective. So I think it's I strongly recommend Joe Biden if he win the election 2024, not this year. Strongly inviting the Kim Yo-jong to Washington National play a game or New York Broadway musical in having a conversation. If North Korea has a lot of American students in Pyongyang, and also if MIT, Stanford, the University of Toronto have a daughter and son of a North Korean upper middle class as a student, not for nuclear engineering, but for medical school or for other places. Southern North Korean rich class son and daughter study here, and US will be starting of a peace process, right? So I think so we need to have a more paradigm shift and the opening up the idea, and also have to focus on one big enemy rather than so many small enemies. That's why China is a dictatorship now is Xi Jinping already opened up his ambition on Taiwanese, right? From the CIA director, he already ordered invasion of Taiwan in 5 years to PLA, for example. And we also have a US military base in Pyeongtaek. So if we have something happen in Taiwan, it's not just faraway issue. Yes, we have a US military base in Pyeongtaek, and Chinese PLA maybe want to attack the Pyeongtaek with a cyber operation or something like that. So this is an all connected problem. So I strongly support my government to join the Quad and join the Five Eyes country and join AUKUS, but not because of only North Korean problem, but because of the more fundamental problem in this region, Chinese dictatorship. That's why I suggest we need to have a more new balance of power. We decreasing North Korean nuclear threat and missile threat, and opening up some dialogue because of North Korea. Do you remember why North Korea didn't have any kind of military exercise with China over the 7 decades? They never have. Natural question is, they have to have, because of long US exercise, now it's bigger and bigger. I strongly support the Japanese security cooperation with our ROC and US also, including Canadian Australia forces as well as the name of UN forces. But why North Korea didn't have any kind of exercise over the decade? Because North Korea doesn't want it. There is very simple the symbol what North Korea wants. So we need to open up our mindset. North Korea, China, this is $1 in China. If you are North Korea, there is no market to buy this $1 pen. How about Chinese businessmen sell this pen to North Korea? Not $1, $10, right? If this is North Korean coal mine, $10 North Korea coal mine, if you're a businessman from China, how much price do you want to pay for this one? You pay just $1, not $10. This is a North Korean-China relationship over the decade. That's why North Korean every day the enemy is China, not America. America is about more theoretical enemy, but China is a very the complication relationship with North Korea. We can use this kind of the relationship between the two, and we need to have a more opening up a new idea of using for the long term, not just in 5 years. So I answered to the question, but yeah, right.
That was excellent. Great insights, Professor Kim. Christopher, if I can move on to you.
What I really want to do is ask a follow-up question to Professor Kim, but I'll restrain myself.
Lunchtime.
Exactly, right. everybody else might be thinking about that. I do agree with Professor Kim that we have to be patient. And so on the question of how to reopen dialogue with North Korea is not always equally ready to engage in dialogue, right? And at the moment, regrettably, they're not. So we have to wait until they reach a point where they wish to or participate in some form of dialogue. The problem with that is one gets accused of acquiescing to their development of tactical nuclear weapons, for example, because we sense that there is a 7th nuclear test coming, and were that to happen, there would probably be an 8th and a 9th too. So it's very difficult. But the point is only to say that just because we want to have more dialogue with North Korea in the next year doesn't mean that North Korea wants to have dialogue with us. It sounds commonsensical, but it's always worth repeating that unfortunately they have agency in this process too. I don't want to comment on question 2 and 3, but I do want to make sure that, Jonathan, you do, even though you're only the moderator, we want to hear what you have to say on specific steps for the next 12 months for Canada. I don't think I have a full enough grip on Canada's capacities to make sensible statements about that. So I'm going to leave that to my distinguished fellow panelists. Humanitarianism is a very interesting point because Canadian NGOs dealing with North Korea have for decades now had a very good reputation for creative engagements with North Korea. That is an area of strength that Canada should be proud of. It brings with it some difficulties because sometimes these engagements run afoul of the views of some larger neighbors, but I think it should be humanitarian engagement where possible. Although I take your point that Kim Jong-un would rather sell things to people than receive things for free. I think one problem he may run into when he actually tries to do that is that his things aren't very good. And so selling them is rather difficult. That's a separate question. But yes, to the degree that North Korea is willing to engage, and I think it is willing to with humanitarian actors, that should be encouraged. And that reputation Canada already has in that sphere should be supported and extended as far as it possibly can be.
That's great. And thank you for deferring to me, but I will defer myself. I have to come up here again after lunch to speak, so I don't want to spoil my speech. That's my excuse while I think of those answers. And Trevor, you don't have an excuse because you're on the panel right now. So I will defer immediately to you on those questions. And then we will break for lunch after this. I know there's probably more questions, but we have another panel and we have lunch to discuss those. So Trevor, the last words will be yours.
Excellent. Well, on maybe the second question around engagement with middle powers, I think this is really for the whole of the region, something I brought up before, and I really hope is articulated in the strategy, but if not, this is work for the future. We have partnerships. I mean, we operate in parallel of, the government's foreign policy, but it would be great if we can work with the government, right? We have institutional partnerships. I mentioned the FKI relationship. Just with the Business Council, we work with the Business Council of Australia, the Keidanren in Japan, the CII in India, hopefully with Kedin in Indonesia in the near future, but we have good partnerships. And so we're happy to be a willing partner in support of a successful Canadian strategy for the region. So that's just one thought. On the issue of 6 to 12 months, what specific things could Canada do for the Canada-Korea relationship? One really important one, and this came up in our visit, was ensuring that some of these recent major investments that Korean companies have made in Canada proceed smoothly, because we have a reputation and we want to make sure we have a positive reputation going forward. I wasn't here for the minister's speech this morning, but I know our industry minister is very seized with this topic, and I know other parts of government are as well. So just very important that across government that these investments proceed smoothly and we develop a positive reputation emerging from some of the more recent ones. Trade policy wise, as I mentioned, if Korea does take the formal step to apply for the CPTPP, that Canada is supportive. I know there's a complicated process working with our CPTPP partners and getting consensus, but we may want to take a position on that given some of the other challenges and decisions we may have to make with other applicants. So this is kind of a selfish point, and Jim is involved in this process as well, but we're part of the organizing committee for the Canada-Korea Forum. So it's on us to hold a successful forum in Korea next year. We just hosted a successful meeting in Toronto last month. So to continue with that, and we had some really good government engagement and support for that forum. So that's one other, and I'd say a final point is I know there's a lot of expectations that the Prime Minister will visit next year. I have no reason to believe that he wouldn't, but that's very important, especially for the anniversary of our relationship, and to have more ministers visit the country. Foreign Minister was recently there. I understand our industry minister may visit in the near future, and others. But I mean, one point that was brought up on our visit this year was it was somewhere between 4 and 6 years. People weren't really sure, but that was the length of time between a ministerial visit. So that was something that the business community noted to us. I'm sure the government was even more aware of that point. So just keeping up the drumbeat of Canadian official engagement and hopefully business engagement as well. And to Jeff's question at the end, not to mix up humanitarian and development assistance, but and I know this will be one of the focuses of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but it can't just be economic. It can't just be foreign affairs. There's a defense element to this, and there's a development assistance humanitarian element to it as well. I thought it was take off my business council hat. I thought it was a really smart move by the government to get involved early on in this the partnership with the Blue Pacific, the kind of South Pacific initiative that the U.S. just launched. It seems to be just a really smart decision to get in there early. It probably isn't a major investment on behalf of our government, but it shows that we're serious about supporting the region. And I've heard that this issue has come up in our engagement with other partners around the region, that we're not maybe we're not contributing enough to the development of the region or to help out the humanitarian situation. So just a quick thought there.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Trevor. That is very helpful. And before we break for lunch, I just wanted to quickly touch on this idea. And I'm hoping this segues nicely into our lunch discussion, and also the second panel is this idea of middle power diplomacy too, because I think this will come up a bit in our second session. My own thoughts on this, and just to give you an anecdote, earlier this year we had a private dialogue with a non-Indo-Pacific nation, which is a small nation. And we had a former Canadian official who was there from our side, and mentioned, Canada, we're just a small country. There's a limited amount of things that we can do. We have to pick and choose our battles. And it was interesting to see this dynamic with this very, very small country. And one of the officials mentioned and said, "You're a small country? Like a helicopter, you take a helicopter over our country and you could see it all. If we were in your position, we'd be the most arrogant kid in the class." So again, not to say that we shouldn't engage in middle power diplomacy. There are constraints to what we do, but we shouldn't forget we're a G7 country, we're in G20, we're in APEC, we're in all of the economic forums, all of the political forums, Five Eyes from a security intelligence perspective. We're blessed with natural resources, even if we don't know how to get them out to suppliers. We have a lot going for us, agricultural superpower. So we can do things in middle power terms, and we should do things in middle power terms, but there are also other ways that we can engage as well. So I think it's just something to leave you out for lunch. But thank you so much to the panel. A round of applause for them doing the hard lifting. And bon appetit.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, and the panel speakers. We'll be here all day, but we have a second session in the afternoon, and I think you should enjoy your lunch. So feel free to go out and grab your lunch, have some more conversation. We were going to do photos, but I'm going to defer that to later on. So bon appetit.